The 13th edition of the Commonwealth Games opened in Edinburgh, the second time the event had been held in the city after a successful 1970 Games. However, these games were controversial from the outset, when 32 of the eligible 59 countries boycotted them in protest over the Thatcher government's policy of maintaining sporting links with apartheid South Africa. These games would therefore see the lowest turnout since the 1950 edition of its predecessor, the British Empire Games in Auckland, all of which meant that the organisers were facing a large financial deficit, as advertisers and broadcasters also lost interest in the games. Media tycoon Robert Maxwell took over as chairman, promising to invest £2 million, but in the end only contributing $250,000, and it took the City of Edinburgh 3 years to pay off its debts from hosting the event. After a week's competition, the Games closed with the England team topping the medals table ahead of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Wales and hosts Scotland. And with the new football season approaching, both Manchester United and West Ham United had arranged friendly games in Europe, only for 150 of their fans to clash on the Amsterdam ferry, which was turned back to England as hooligans fought with knives and bottles. The year-old ban on English clubs in European competitions was immediately extended, and it was also suggested that it might be extended to ban friendly matches too. The international reputation of English football had never been lower. And in Melbourne, Australia, one of Picasso's series of Weeping Woman paintings was stolen from the National Gallery of Victoria. The thieves left a card signed ACT saying the work had been removed for cleaning, which was originally assumed to refer to the Australian Capital Territory and that the painting had been removed to Canberra. However, a following note from a group calling itself Australian Cultural Terrorists demanded a ransom in the form of increased arts funding and a prize for young artists. A nationwide hunt for the painting was launched, and after some feelers were put out to possible suspects indicating that the authorities were only interested in recovering the painting, and if it was left in a certain locker at a certain station, no more questions would be asked, the painting was recovered, along with a note from ACT saying that they never expected their demands to be met and, quote, "Our intention was always to bring to public attention the plight of a group which lacks any of the legitimate means of blackmailing governments." Meanwhile, the Formula One circus prepared to make its first foray behind the Iron Curtain. Previous attempts had been made to organise a race in the USSR, but had rarely progressed beyond the initial stages, but now the government of Hungary opened its doors to this most capitalist of sports. In the 1960s and 70s, Hungary had been one of the poster children for the Eastern Bloc, the policy of so-called goulash communism, ensuring a comparatively high standard of living and cultural freedom. It was being widely described as the happiest barracks. The oil crisis of the 1970s plunged the government into debt and led, in 1985, to the first fall in living standards since the 1960s, and many of the journalists and F1 personnel were cautious about the prospect of racing there. Hungary had held a Grand Prix once before, in June 1936. It was a shame they just missed the 50th anniversary, which was won by Tazio Nuvolari in an Alfa Romeo, with the auto unions of Bernd Rosemeyer and Achille Varzi making up the podium, and of which footage still survives. That was a temporary circuit in the Nepliget Park in central Budapest, and Bernie Ecclestone's initial suggestion was for something similar, or a street circuit, but instead the Hungarian government decided to build a brand new, permanent facility just outside the capital near the village of Magyarod. Ground was broken in October of 1985, with construction taking just 8 months, and was signed off in May, but a previously unknown underground stream had left the circuit being even twistier than originally planned. So the teams arrived in early August with fairly low expectations, for the circuit was looking difficult to pass on, and also not relishing a weekend of grey food, grey architecture, grey people and grey-faced policemen watching their every move. The reality, of course, couldn't be further from the truth. Even in those days, Budapest was a gorgeous city with a lively nightlife, wonderful food and wine, and the people were unfailingly friendly and welcoming. The circuit facilities were top-notch too, with any worries about the subpar rushed construction quickly dispelled, and while there no doubt was a hefty security presence at the track, filled with Austrians and West Germans as well as the local fans, a crowd some 200,000 strong in all, there were fewer police in evidence than at, say, Monza. Most agreed that it was at least up to the standards of the new Jerez circuit in Spain, and that the organisation was far slicker. The rumour mill continued to work, of course, with it now being reported that McLaren designer John Barnard had been signed up by Ferrari to try and cure their woes, while BMW were reportedly reconsidering their decision to pull out of F1, and might at least continue supplying Brabham if Bernie wants us to. But on current form, something had to change for the boys in blue and white. In order to increase downforce to cope with the tight circuit, Gordon Murray had added extra winglets to the side pods. They'd also used them at Detroit, which meant that the drivers couldn't see in their mirrors very well, and to top it all, Riccardo Patrese had an infected wisdom tooth and an operation booked for the day after the race. Another BMW user, Arrows, was having car problems of its own. The debut of the A9 at Hockenheim hadn't been a success, and the team had taken out their problematic transmission and rebuilt the rear end to A8 specs with a more conventional gearbox. The A9 had the gear cluster positioned ahead of the differential. Boutsen tried the new A9 hybrid on Friday, but decided to revert to the A8 for the rest of the weekend, while Danner persisted with the new car. Both were plagued with turbo failures and engine failures over both qualifying sessions. Minardi also had a new car for nominal team leader De Cesaris, the M186, which looked outwardly very similar to the M185B, but had reworked suspension, improved aerodynamics, and a lighter monocoque. Nigel Mansell marked his 32nd birthday by announcing a new 2-year deal with Frank Williams, who was present for his first Grand Prix of the year outside the UK, though there were still persistent rumours that Nigel had in fact already signed for Ferrari and possibly now had 2 signed contracts in his pocket. Nigel went fastest on Friday, but was unable to improve on Saturday as he went off avoiding one Brabham, that of Patrese, and was balked by Warwick in the other one as he overtook Streff on his second run. Being new and rather dusty, the track was distinctly slippery, and several drivers, including Mansell, tried qualifying on race tyres in order to give themselves more hot laps before they wore out. Senna took a gamble on doing both sessions on qualifiers, giving himself basically 2 hot laps. His first was enough to grab him pole, which was just as well as he slithered and spun on his other attempt. He was joined on the front row by Nelson Piquet, with Prost and Mansell lining up behind. Keke Rosberg was 5th, with Tombe an excellent 6th on a circuit where grid position looked like it would be all important. Johansson was 7th, Dumfries 8th, with Arnoux and Jones making up the top 10, the Australian having had De Cesaris blow an engine right in front of him twice in 2 days. Berger and Fabi were 11th and 12th, both having fallen foul of Rothengatter, while Alboretto's wheel fell off on Saturday, leaving him languishing in 15th. Nannini did very well to put his old Minardi 17th, while De Cesaris in the new car was only 20th, and the Arrowses were likewise way down in 21st and 22nd, with the Zakspeeds and Dezellas bringing up the rear as usual. Senna wasn't entirely happy with the pole assignment on the dusty right side of the track, but it couldn't be changed, and the cars lined up for the first Hungarian Grand Prix in 50 years. Despite Senna's misgivings, he got a good start, while both Piquet and Prost seemed a little sluggish away, and Mansell wriggled in between them, out-dragging Piquet into second place as they went into the first corner. Behind them, Tombe had also made a fantastic start to go 4th as they wove through the slow turns 2 and 3. By the end of lap 1, Senna already had a decent lead, followed by Mansell and Piquet, Tombe, Prost and Jones in the second Haas Lola. The Ford V8 seemed to really like this track, with Dumfries 7th and Arnoux 8th. Alan Berg's turbo went on the opening lap, while Piquet muscled past Mansell off camera as Senna pulled away from both of them. Nelson also put a few car lengths between himself and Mansell, who in turn began to pull away from Tombe, now clearly holding up Prost. Piquet closed up on Senna as Prost finally found a way through, and Rosberg had got ahead of Dumfries into 7th behind the 2 Lolas. Patrese had a gearbox failure on lap 5 which spun him onto the curb where he was beached, and on the same lap the new Minardi M186's debut came to a rather premature end with an engine failure. Tombe had an off-camera spin and dropped to 7th, and all the time Piquet slowly gained on Senna. Christian Danner retired the Arrows A9 with a suspension problem, and Prost had closed right up on Mansell by now and was beginning to challenge for 3rd. By lap 10 of the planned 77, Piquet was up with Senna and starting to look for a way past, but they were few and far between, with the only nailed-on passing place being at the end of the pit straight. Prost passed Mansell there on lap 11 while the cameras concentrated on the battle for the lead, but took a brief moment to watch the marshals' attempts to get Patrese's car off the track. It had, to be fair, landed in a very awkward spot. Jones was having some issues and came in from 5th to have his car looked at. Then at start of lap 12, Piquet suddenly lunged through on the outside, catching Senna off guard, while Prost had swiftly left Mansell behind and began closing on the leaders. Senna was visibly slowing now, and Prost took lumps out of the gap, while Piquet carved his way through the first backmarkers and left them both behind. So it was Piquet, Senna, Prost, Mansell, Rosberg and Dumfries in the top 6 as Prost arrived on the rear of Senna and set about looking for a way past, only to suddenly drop back again and peel into the pits on lap 7 with an electrical problem. Unfortunately, while the team were looking at him, Rosberg arrived for a tyre stop of his own and had to be waved through. All of which put Mansell back up to 3rd, with Dumfries 4th and Berger 5th, while Derek Warwick was now 6th, but not for long as Rosberg fumed past trying to recover from his not actually a pit stop. The Finn came in again the next time around, as the McLaren team had pushed Prost's stricken car out of the way briefly, before finally getting the champion's car back on the track some 8 laps down. Mansell was in next, making a good 8.6 second stop, while Warwick's good work was undone by being rear-ended by Alboreto, punting him into the gravel trap and out of the race, while Michele turned round to retire in the pits with a damaged front end. There was a heart-stopping moment when Patrick Tambay, struggling with understeer, spun on the last corner, leaving him stranded on the circuit. He was pushed out of the way by some brave marshals and got going again, just as his teammate Jones came past, being lapped by Mansell. And then on lap 33, Piquet came in for the lead for his stop, as Senna came through to take the first place and got the hammer down to take best advantage, as the Williams team turned Piquet around in a rapid 8.1 seconds, returning him to the track second. McLaren's woes continued, as Rosberg retired with suspension trouble, while Prost had already retired with a similar problem, and after 36 laps Senna led Piquet by 21.88 seconds, with Mansell about 37 seconds behind his teammate and the only other driver on the lead lap. Behind them, Berger, Brundle and Johansson made up the top 6. It was beginning to look like Senna was planning to go the whole race on his first set of tyres, but he finally did stop at the end of lap 41 with a lead of some 30 seconds over Nelson Piquet. A sticking wheel nut cost him a little time, but he was still able to return to the track some 7.7 seconds in the lead. With both Brazilians having stopped, it was now a race to the finish, with Senna looking good to take his 3rd win of the year as he pulled out 2 seconds on Piquet on his first lap out of the pits. Bootson's electrics went, making his 8th retirement of 11 so far, and his old teammate Berger retired his Benetton with a transmission failure on lap 45, which promoted Dumfries to 5th and Brundle to 6th. Mansell came in for a new set of tyres, with his second set having not been working for him, and meanwhile Piquet had got the bit between his teeth, stabilised the gap, and then set about reeling Senna in. Senna lapped Mansell, meaning the 2 battling Brazilians were now the only 2 on the same lap, but then seemed to suddenly slow as Mansell unlapped himself again and headed off into the distance. Piquet, meanwhile, was taking huge lumps out of Senna's lead, who seemed to have some problem, though nobody knew quite what, leading Murray Walker to utter one of his immortal Murrayisms: "I can't imagine what the problem is that Senna has got. I imagine it must be some kind of grip problem." And by lap 54, the 2 compatriots were running close together. Earlier in the race, Piquet had sold Senna a dummy and dived through on the inside of turn 1, and he tried it again here, only to drift wide on the dusty surface, catch himself and slot back in to try again. 2 laps later, he was ready for another go. This time, he went left as Senna defended the inside line and practically drifted his Williams round the outside to take the lead in a superb move. Piquet quickly pulled away, and for the remaining 20 laps or so he dictated the pace, easing off at one point to allow Senna to catch up again, only to promptly clear off into the distance once more. The 2-hour time limit was reached at the end of lap 76, 1 short of the planned total, and so the podium was exactly as it had been at Hockenheim 2 weeks earlier. A Brazilian 1-2, the 3rd of the year after Rio, so please ignore what I said last time, with Mansell a distant lapped 3rd, but happy enough with another 4 points to extend his championship lead as Prost failed to score. Stefan Johansson drove a quiet race after 2 early stops to finish 4th, his first points since Belgium, with Johnny Dumfries finally posting his first points in 5th, and Martin Brundle overcoming a lack of 4th gear to take the last point for 6th place. The French trio of Tambay, Streff and Alliot were just out of the points, with Palmer trailing in 10th 6 laps down. Williams thus increased their lead in the Constructors' Championship to 39 points, while Prost dropped from 2nd to 4th place in the drivers' standings as both Brazilians came past. The brace of 1-2 results for Piquet and Senna had made the Mansell-Prost title race into a 4-way battle with just 5 races to go, the next being in a week's time just over the border in Austria.